Over the last couple of episodes of Beyond at Home, we've been trying to help you answer the question, what do you want? So that you can discover and get what you really want. And as we kind of wrap this series up, in this episode, I'm going to help you answer the question, what do you do when you discover what you really want so that you don't get distracted? Now, why this is an important question for us to answer is because one part of the challenge is discovering what you really want or what you really value, what's really, really important to you. But the bigger challenge is what do you do when you've found that out? Because the world that we live in is designed to distract us from what really matters. In fact, in 2020, Netflix released a documentary called The Social Dilemma, where developers from Google and Pinterest and Instagram and Facebook all came together to share some of the ways that these social media applications are designed. And one of the things that they highlighted was that the average person picks up their phone 150 times a day. That's staggering to think that 150 times during the day, we will pick our phone up and we will be distracted from what we're doing to engage in something else. Now, this is a big deal for you and this is a big deal for me because it's not just enough for us to figure out, hey, these are the things I really value, but we have to have a process. We have to have a way to figure out, hey, once I know what I really value, what do I do to ensure that I don't get distracted from what I really want? And the good news is I know someone who's going to help us put together a little bit of a process so that you and I don't get distracted. Now, before I introduce you to this person, we talk about what we're going to talk about. If you are brand new to faith, my best suggestion for you is, hey, go back to episode 3 and watch that episode first before continuing with this video, because that will give you a whole lot of context for everything that we're going to talk about now. Now, the person I want to introduce you to is a guy called Paul. And Paul steps onto the pages of history not as a Jesus follower, but as a Christian killer. And he doesn't go down in history as a Christian killer. In fact, he goes down in history as one of the most ardent supporters of the Jesus movement. He's one of the biggest evangelists that ever lived. And we've looked at some of the letters that he wrote to churches that he visited and churches that he started in this series. But in this episode, we're not going to look at a letter Paul wrote to a church he started or a church he went to. In fact, we're going to look at a letter he wrote to a church that he wanted to go to, the church in Rome. Now, here's something fascinating that I think you need to know about this letter. The first thing is that this letter was written in around the year 57 AD, which is about 27 years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus, because Jesus died in around 30 AD. And this letter isn't written to people who were living in and around the region of Jerusalem and Palestine, which is where Jesus lived. No. This letter is written to people who lived in Rome, which is over 22,500 kilometers away from Jerusalem, which in the first century, it's just unfathomable to think that the news of the death and the resurrection of Jesus would travel that far if it wasn't true, which tells me something had to be going on. Something had to cause these people to keep leaning in to this message. The other thing you need to know about the city of Rome is that there were Christians everywhere. At this point in time, the emperor of Rome was a guy called Nero. And Nero was 19 years old when this letter was written. He was a really young emperor. In fact, he came in to power when he was just 16 years old. And at this point in time that we're going to jump into this letter, everything between Nero and the Christians was going well. Although that would only last a few years until there was a big fire in Rome and Nero would point the finger at the Christians. And Nero would start persecuting and executing Christians to advance a political agenda. So with everything going on, this is how Paul writes and how Paul tells us, hey, here's the process to help you get what you really want. It starts in chapter 12. He says, so here's what I want you to do. Now, this is kind of one of those parts where it's kind of like, all right, so there must have been some preamble. There must have been some stuff that I missed. In the first 11 chapters of this letter, Paul explains, hey, God is for you. He explains, hey, here's why God sent Jesus into the world, and here's what the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus mean for you. And so when he writes this in the letter, he goes, hey, as a result of that, because of that, due to that, here's what I want you to do. God helping you. In other words, you're not doing this on your own. Take your everyday, ordinary life. And then he explains, hey, here's what we all do on a day-to-day basis. You're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work, and you're walking around life. And then he says to do this: place it before God as an offering. And to us 21st century listeners and readers and viewers, we kind of are like, oh, what? Like, what is that? Paul, what are you talking about? But to the first century world, there was pagan religions, there was Roman religions, there was Greek religions, and all of them involved animal sacrifice. And so they would have been asking the question like, hang on, Paul, do you want us to sacrifice ourselves? And Paul would have been like, well, yes and no. Jesus had already made the ultimate sacrifice for you. We covered that in the first 11 chapters. But I want you to live in such a way that your lives are given to God. And a lot of us are kind of like, whoa, that's kind of too far, Paul. Are you saying that I have to kind of give my life as a blank check to God? But Paul knew that we would resist. And so Paul writes on and he says this, he goes, hey, embracing what God does for you is actually the best thing you can do for him. In other words, if God is actually so for you, if God actually has a plan for you, if God was willing to give up his life for you, then it's actually not the smartest thing to do to run away from it. The smartest thing that you could do to get what you really want is actually to lean in to what God has for you. And then he says this. He says, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. In other words, every culture has patterns and themes that exist within it. And we explored at the start of this video that one of the patterns and one of the themes of our culture is distraction. We are so torn and so easily distracted that focus is often a superpower in our culture. And so I don't want you, Paul would say, hey, I don't want you to get so used to being distracted that you actually lose sight of what you really want. And then he said this, instead, fix your attention to God. And when you do that, you'll be changed. You'll be transformed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants for you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out in you and develops well-formed maturity in you. Paul says, hey, if you want to get what you really want, then the best way to do that is to see what God sees and live the way that God would have you live. Now, if you resist that, or you're not sure what that would look like to do that, then stick around, because what I've got next for you might just help you to address that. Now, here's what you need to know. I love how in that passage, Paul talks about the way that God transforms us. It happens from the inside out. Now, depending on your experience with God, maybe you think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, isn't God concerned with behavior modification and the things I do and the things I say? And Paul would say, no, that's not the whole story. In fact, God wants to transform you from the inside, the way you think about, the way you engage, the way you relate to God, and that will change the way you behave and the way you live. And so the question that I have to help you get what you really want is simply this. What are some thoughts or beliefs that you have about God that need to be transformed? What is some thinking about God that maybe needs to change and maybe needs to be transformed from the inside out? See, so many of us think that in order to get what we really want, we need to behave a certain way. But the truth is, maybe the easiest way for us to get what we really want is to recognize that the things that you want, the things that I want, are not that far separated from what God wants from us. And if we could change the way we think about God, then maybe we would get what we really want all along. So let me ask you one final time. What do you want? If you answer that question, if you discover what you really want, then maybe, just maybe, you will bump into what God wants for you as well.